Welcome, dear friends, to a journey through time where magnolia blossoms carry secrets whispered by generations, and Spanish moss sways with stories of hearts that dared to love beyond convention. In the next hour, you'll be transported to a world of grand plantations and gentle souls, where one young woman's courage challenged the very foundations of Southern society, and where true love bloomed in gardens tended by hands both free and bound. This is more than just a love story. It's a testament to the transformative power of compassion, the courage required to change what seems unchangeable, and the profound truth that love, when rooted in respect and nurtured by shared purpose, can indeed move mountains and reshape destinies. You'll witness how Hope Elizabeth Fairmont, a 19-year-old woman facing her family's ruin, discovers strength she never knew she possessed and love she never dared to dream possible. From the cobblestone streets of Charleston to the cotton fields of the Ashley River Valley, from glittering ballrooms to humble slave quarters, this tale will take you into a world where honor and duty dance with passion and conscience, where every choice carries the weight of generations, and where one brave heart dares to imagine a different future. But before we embark on this enchanting journey together, I'm curious, from what corner of our beautiful world are you joining us today? Are you watching from a bustling city or a quiet countryside? From across the ocean, or perhaps from the very lands where this story unfolds? I'd love to know where Hope's tale will touch a heart tonight. If this story moves your soul, as I believe it will, please don't forget to subscribe to join our community of story lovers and leave a like to help these timeless tales reach other hearts that need to hear them. Your support helps keep these stories alive for future generations who deserve to know that love can conquer even the most entrenched systems of injustice. Now close your eyes for a moment and let us step through the mists of time, past the boundaries of the present, into an age of carriages and candlelight, of honor and hardship, of love that dared to change the world. Charleston, South Carolina, September 1856. In the golden twilight of the antebellum South, where cotton reigned as king and honor ruled the hearts of men and women alike, the morning mist clung to Magnolia Grove Plantation like whispered prayers from generations past, each droplet carrying within it the weight of secrets that had festered in silence for far too long. Hope Elizabeth Fairmont stood at the towering window of her father's mahogany-paneled study, her slender fingers tracing delicate patterns on glass that had witnessed 3 generations of Fairmont dreams, triumphs and now devastating failures. The black silk of her morning dress, cut in the latest fashion from Charleston's finest dressmaker, rustled softly with each breath, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat in the long, sorrowful months since Colonel Charles Fairmont had drawn his last breath in this very room. The study itself seemed to mourn its master's passing. Leather-bound volumes of military history and classical literature lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their gilt lettering catching the pale morning light that filtered through heavy velvet drapes. The colonel's pipe still rested in its ivory holder on the massive desk, as if he might return at any moment to finish the letter that lay half-written beneath papers that would reshape Hope's entire world. The familiar sense of tobacco, leather, and the jasmine that climbed the walls outside created a bittersweet perfume that made his absence feel both immediate and eternal. Behind Hope, the silence was broken only by the soft turning of pages as Samuel, her 16-year-old brother, attempted to make sense of documents that spoke of debts deeper than the Ashley River and promises broken like autumn leaves beneath careless feet. He sat rigid in their father's leather chair, a chair that seemed far too large for his slight frame, his young face bearing the premature gravity of inherited responsibility that no boy should have to carry. His sandy hair, so like their father's, fell across his forehead as he bent over ledgers filled with numbers that spelled ruin in precise, unforgiving columns. Little Catherine, barely 14 and still possessing the ethereal beauty of childhood, not yet fully surrendered to womanhood, perched on the edge of the ancient settee like a bird uncertain of its nest. Her cornflower blue eyes, wide with unspoken questions and barely contained fear, darted between her siblings as if seeking reassurance that the world they had always known might somehow remain intact. Her pale yellow morning dress, chosen by Hope with careful attention to propriety and their reduced circumstances, seemed to glow in the uncertain light, making her appear almost ghostly in her delicate fragility. The grandfather clock in the corner, a magnificent piece carved from Carolina walnut by craftsmen long dead, marked each passing second with the relentless precision of fate itself. Its brass pendulum swung between past and future, while Hope remained suspended in a present that seemed determined to shatter like fine crystal dropped upon stone. Through the window, past the carefully manicured gardens where late-blooming roses still perfumed the air with defiant beauty, she could see the slave quarters in the distance. Thin ribbons of smoke rose from morning cooking fires, marking the beginning of another day for the 150 souls, whose lives, like her own, hung in the balance of decisions yet to be made. The sound, when it finally came, emerged from the morning stillness like thunder from a clear sky, the rhythmic clatter of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones, growing steadily closer with each passing moment. Hope's breath caught in her throat like silk snagged, on thorns as she recognized the approach of destiny in the form of a visitor who held the power to preserve or destroy everything the Fairmont name had, built over 3 generations. The carriage that rounded the circular drive, pulled by 4 magnificent bay horses, whose coats gleamed like polished mahogany in the dappled sunlight, was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and wealth. Its deep blue paintwork was adorned with silver fittings that caught the light like captured stars, while the family crest emblazoned on its doors spoke of lineage and power that commanded respect throughout the Carolina Low Country. This was no ordinary morning caller's modest conveyance, but rather the traveling palace of a man whose very presence could alter the course of lives with a single word. As the equipage drew to a halt before the wide steps of Magnolia Grove's veranda, Hope felt the last vestiges of her protected childhood slip away like morning mist before the rising sun. The man who would emerge from that elegant carriage was no ordinary creditor come to collect a debt, but William Nathaniel Blackwood, a name spoken in hushed tones throughout Charleston's drawing rooms, a man whose cotton plantations stretched across thousands of acres and whose business interests reached from the wharves of Charleston Harbor to the cotton exchanges of Liverpool and New York. Samuel's voice, still carrying the uncertain crack of youth despite his attempts at manly authority, broke the heavy silence. "Hope, he's here. Mr. Blackwood has arrived." Hope turned from the window with the fluid grace that years of deportment lessons had ingrained in her very bones, her hands smoothing the black silk of her skirts with unconscious elegance. Whatever transpired in the next hour would determine not only her own fate, but that of Samuel and Catherine, of Magnolia Grove itself, and of every soul who called this plantation home. The Colonel's debts, accumulated through gambling losses in the high-stakes parlors of New Orleans and disastrous investments in railroad speculation that had promised wealth but delivered only ruin, had created a web of obligation that could only be resolved through sacrifice of the most profound kind. What manner of man was this William Blackwood, and what price would he demand for mercy that might preserve a family's honor while costing them their freedom? William Nathaniel Blackwood descended from his carriage with the fluid, practiced grace of a man born to command, every movement speaking of confidence earned through 3 decades of life spent mastering both business and society. His tall, powerful frame was elegantly attired in a charcoal traveling coat of the finest English wool, cut by tailors who understood that true authority required no ostentatious display. The silver-headed walking stick he carried was not mere affectation, but a tool of genuine utility, bearing the subtle scars of actual use, while his polished boots spoke of a man who, despite his obvious wealth, was no stranger to the practical demands of plantation management. Hope observed him from behind the delicate lace curtains of the parlor window, studying this man who held her family's destiny in his capable hands. His face, she noticed, possessed the kind of strong, angular features that suggested both intelligence and determination, a square jaw that spoke of resolution, dark eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of their surroundings with the precision of a military strategist, and silver threading through his dark hair at the temples that added gravitas to his 32 years. There was something in his bearing that commanded respect without demanding it, an authority that seemed to flow from inner certainty rather than mere social position. As he paused on the veranda to survey Magnolia Grove with those penetrating eyes, Hope found herself wondering what he saw in their once grand estate. Did he notice the subtle signs of financial distress that had begun to appear over the past year, the paint that needed refreshing on the shutters, the gardens where some of the more exotic plantings had been allowed to return to native growth, the reduced staff that meant certain maintenance had been deferred? Or did he see only the fundamental beauty of the place, the solid bones of a plantation that had been built to last generations? When Jessamine, their most trusted house servant, and a woman whose dignity had always impressed even the most critical Charleston society matrons, announced his arrival with the formal protocol that such an occasion demanded, the very air in the parlor seemed to thicken with anticipation. The room itself, furnished with pieces that represented the finest craftsmanship of 3 generations, provided an appropriate backdrop for negotiations that would determine the future of a family and an estate that had weathered revolution, economic upheaval, and the changing tides of Southern society. William entered the parlor with his silk hat held respectfully in hands that Hope found herself studying with unwitting fascination. They were strong, well-manicured hands that spoke of good breeding and careful attention to personal grooming. Yet they bore the subtle calluses and small scars that indicated he was no mere drawing-room gentleman who left all physical labor to others. These were the hands of a man who had built his empire through personal involvement in every aspect of his enterprises, from the cotton fields to the counting houses. Miss Fairmont, his voice carried the smooth, cultured cadence of generations bred to authority, yet underneath its polished surface, Hope detected notes of genuine warmth and something that might have been compassion. I come bearing both my deepest condolences for the loss of your esteemed father, and I sincerely hope a solution to the difficulties that his untimely passing has created for your family. The formal ritual of afternoon tea that followed provided a civilized framework for discussions that were anything but conventional. Jessamine served from the family's finest Limoges china, a service that had been a wedding gift to Hope's grandparents and might soon belong to others, while the Haida participants in this delicate negotiation observed the intricate dance of Southern etiquette that could transform even the most brutal business into an exercise in refined courtesy. As William accepted his cup with the precise movements of a man trained from birth in such social ceremonies, Hope found herself cataloguing details that might reveal his true character beneath the polished exterior. The way he inquired after Catherine's health and Samuel's studies suggested a man who understood that business, however pressing, should never overshadow basic human consideration. When he complimented the excellence of the tea service and the arrangement of late summer flowers that graced the parlor, his words carried the ring of sincere appreciation rather than mere social formula. The discussion of her father's debts, when it finally came, was conducted with a delicacy that made the devastating numbers seem almost manageable. William's voice maintained its cultured modulation as he outlined the extent of Colonel Fairmont's obligations with the precision of a man accustomed to dealing with large sums, yet there was nothing cold or calculating in his manner. Instead, he seemed genuinely regretful that circumstances had created such a burden for a family already grieving the loss of its patriarch. Cotton futures purchased at inflated prices just before a market collapse, railroad speculation that had promised to revolutionize transportation but had instead consumed fortunes without laying a single mile of track. Gambling debts accumulated in the elegant but ruthless salons of New Orleans where gentlemen wagered with money they didn't possess on cards that refused to fall their way. The catalogue of financial disasters fell like autumn leaves, beautiful in their complexity, but devastating in their accumulation. When William finally made his proposal, the words seemed to hang in the perfumed air of the parlor like incense in a cathedral, requiring careful consideration before their full meaning could be absorbed. Marriage, not the romantic union that young ladies dreamed of in the privacy of their chambers, but a practical arrangement that would preserve the Fairmont name while securing the future of Samuel and Catherine. The proposal was delivered with such gentle courtesy and evident respect for Hope's position that it took several moments for the full implications to register in her mind. Here was a man offering himself as the solution to her family's ruin, proposing to take on not only their debts, but their dependence, their responsibilities, and their honor. The offer came wrapped in the language of business, yet Hope detected undertones that suggested more complex motivations than mere financial calculation. When she dared to meet his eyes directly, she saw there a kind of loneliness that wealth and position had been unable to remedy, a hunger for something that could not be purchased with money or commanded through authority. Could such an arrangement, born of necessity rather than affection, ever blossom into something resembling the love that Hope had dreamed of finding, or would she be trading her freedom for security that might prove hollow as summer thunder? October arrived in Charleston, with the ceremonial grandeur of a queen assuming her throne, trading summer's oppressive heat and humidity for the golden warmth that transformed the peninsula city into a stage worthy of the elaborate social drama that was the southern autumn season. The air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility, carrying the mingled fragrances of tea olive and Confederate jasmine that perfumed every garden and courtyard, while the harbor sparkled with the white sails of merchant vessels bringing goods from distant ports, to feed the insatiable appetite of a society that had elevated gracious living to the level of high Art William Blackwood's invitation to spend the season, as his guests in Charleston had been extended with the kind of thoughtful generosity that made acceptance both inevitable and surprisingly welcome. The prospect of escape from Magnolia Grove, where every room held memories of loss and every familiar object served as a reminder of their reduced circumstances, offered Hope and her siblings a respite from grief that they had not realized they desperately needed. The Blackwood mansion on East Bay Street stood like a monument to both prosperity and refined taste, its elegant proportions and careful detailing, speaking of architects who understood that true grandeur lay not in ostentatious display, but in perfect harmony of form and function. The house occupied a commanding position among Charleston's famous Rainbow Row, its pale yellow stucco walls and black ironwork creating a visual symphony that had been pleasing visitors for 3 generations. From the wide piazzas that graced both the front and garden sides of the house, residents and guests could observe the constant ballet of harbor traffic while enjoying breezes that made even the warmest days comfortable. Hope's assigned chamber on the 2nd floor faced the garden, where ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss created a canopy that filtered sunlight into patterns of gold and green that shifted like living lace throughout the day. Camellia bushes preparing for their spectacular winter blooming, lined pathways that led to a fountain, whose gentle music provided a constant, soothing backdrop to the more distant sounds of the city beyond the garden walls. Her room itself was a masterpiece of comfort and elegance, furnished with pieces that represented the finest craftsmanship from London, Paris, and New York, yet arranged with such careful attention to both beauty and practicality that the space felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Each morning brought the pleasure of descending the gracefully curved main staircase to find William already at his breakfast in the sunny morning room, surrounded by newspapers and correspondence that connected him to events throughout the South and beyond. He read with the intense concentration of a military commander studying intelligence reports, occasionally sharing observations about cotton prices, political developments, or cultural events that revealed a mind equally comfortable with commerce, statecraft, and the arts. His comments on the latest installment of Charles Dickens's serialized novel showed the same careful attention to detail that he brought to his analysis of market conditions, while his knowledge of music and poetry suggested depths that purely business-focused education could not account for. Hope found herself looking forward to these morning conversations with an anticipation that surprised her. William's opinions were thoughtfully considered rather than merely fashionable, and he possessed the rare gift of listening to her own ideas with genuine attention, rather than the patronizing indulgence that most men of his generation showed toward feminine observations on serious subjects. When she mentioned her admiration for the female authors who were beginning to challenge traditional literary conventions, he not only knew their work, but could discuss it with an intelligence that made such conversations deeply satisfying. The social whirl of Charleston's autumn season provided ample opportunity for Hope to observe William in his natural element, and what she saw there both impressed and intrigued her. At Mrs. Rutledge's musical, where the city's cultural elite gathered to hear performances by visiting artists from New York and Europe, William moved through the crowd with effortless authority, equally at ease discussing the latest developments in Italian opera with the ladies and debating the implications of political events with the gentlemen. Yet Hope noticed that he seemed to hold something of himself in reserve, participating fully in the social rituals while maintaining a certain distance that suggested either natural reticence or carefully cultivated discretion. During the St. Cecilia Society Ball, the pinnacle of Charleston's social calendar, and an event that drew the most distinguished families from throughout the South, Hope watched William dance with the technical precision that marked a gentleman's education, yet without the joy that such elegant entertainment should inspire. He moved through the intricate steps of country dances and cotillions with the same competent authority he brought to business negotiations, fulfilling his social obligations while seeming somehow detached from the pleasure that such activities could provide. It was during the Calhoun family's garden party, held in the magnificent grounds of their Ashley River plantation, that something fundamental shifted in Hope's understanding of the man who had proposed to rescue her family from ruin. The afternoon was perfect for such entertainment, with golden autumn light filtering through ancient oaks and a gentle breeze carrying the fragrance of late-blooming roses and Confederate jasmine. Tables laden with traditional Carolina delicacies were scattered throughout the gardens, while musicians provided a gentle accompaniment to conversations that flowed as smoothly as the champagne that sparkled in crystal glasses. Hope and William found themselves walking somewhat apart from the other guests, following a path that led through a secluded section of the garden, where climbing roses created natural arbors and hidden benches invited quiet conversation. Their discussion had turned to poetry, specifically Edgar Allan Poe's haunting verses about love and loss that seemed particularly appropriate for two people who had both experienced the profound grief that comes with losing those dearest to them. When William began to recite Annabel Lee from memory, his cultivated voice took on a quality Hope had never heard before, a raw emotion that transformed the familiar words into something deeply personal. As he spoke of a love that was more than love and a loss that could never be fully accepted, Hope found herself seeing past his composed exterior to the lonely, grieving man who lived beneath the successful planter's confident facade. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. The words seemed to come from some deep well of personal experience, carrying with them an ache that no amount of worldly success could heal. Their first kiss came as naturally as evening settling over the harbor, arising from a moment of shared understanding that transcended the practical considerations that had brought them together. Standing beneath a canopy of Spanish moss with the scent of jasmine heavy in the air around them, William's lips found hers with surprising gentleness, as if he feared that too much passion might shatter the delicate trust that was growing between them. In that moment, Hope tasted both the promise of deeper affection and the salt of tears, whether his or hers she could not say. Would this glimpse of William's hidden vulnerability prove to be the foundation for genuine love, or would the weight of social expectations and practical necessities prevent their hearts from following where that first kiss seemed to lead? Blackwood Plantation sprawled along the Ashley River like a verdant kingdom carved from the Carolina wilderness by 3 generations of ambition, vision, and the labor of human hands, both free and enslaved. The great house, approached by an avenue of ancient live oaks whose Spanish moss-draped branches created a natural cathedral, rose from perfectly manicured grounds with the serene confidence of a structure built to endure for centuries. Its white-painted brick walls and towering columns seemed to glow in the gentle morning light, while wraparound piazzas on both levels provided spaces where residents could observe the vast expanse of their domain while remaining sheltered from the intensity of the southern sun. Hope's first view of what might become her future home struck her with a mixture of awe and trepidation that she struggled to conceal. The scale of the enterprise was breathtaking, 2,000 acres of prime bottomland devoted to cotton cultivation, with additional acreage supporting the vegetables, livestock, and timber necessary to make the plantation virtually self-sufficient. The complexity of managing such an operation suddenly made William's reputation for business acumen seem not just well-deserved, but absolutely essential for the survival of the hundreds of people whose lives depended on the plantation's continued prosperity. Her assigned chamber in the main house faced east, offering views across the cotton fields, where workers moved through the rows with the steady rhythm of those who understood that their labor would determine not only their own fate, but that of everyone connected to the plantation community. The room itself represented the pinnacle of comfort and elegance, furnished with pieces imported from London and Paris, yet arranged with such attention to both beauty and practicality that Hope felt immediately welcomed rather than overwhelmed by luxury she had never experienced. Hope's first morning at Blackwood began before dawn, awakened not by her assigned lady's maid, but by the deep, resonant sound of the plantation bell calling field hands to their daily labor. The sound seemed to emerge from the very soul of the place, carrying with it generations of tradition and the weight of lives shaped by rhythms that had remained essentially unchanged since the first cotton seeds had been planted in Carolina soil. From her bedroom window, she watched the daily procession of men, women, and children moving through the morning mist, like figures from some ancient tableau, their forms gradually becoming distinct as the light strengthened and the day's work began in earnest. The sight stirred something deep within her consciousness, a discomfort she had learned to suppress during her sheltered upbringing at Magnolia Grove, but which could no longer be ignored when confronted with such stark and immediate reality. The contrast between the elegance of her surroundings and the conditions she observed in the slave quarters created a cognitive dissonance that made concentration on ordinary activities nearly impossible. How could she appreciate the exquisite workmanship of her bedroom furniture, while knowing that the people who had created the wealth to purchase such luxuries lived in circumstances that would have appalled her if discovered. In any white family's circumstances, William found her in the morning room shortly after sunrise, staring into her untouched coffee as if seeking answers to questions she was only beginning to formulate. His presence filled the doorway with quiet authority, and when he spoke, his voice carried the practical, matter-of-fact tone of a man accustomed to discussing complex business operations as easily as other men might comment on the weather. "The harvest promises to be exceptional this year," he said, settling into the chair across from her with morning reports spread between them like maps of human commerce. "Henderson estimates we'll exceed last season's yield by at least 300 bales, possibly more if the weather holds." Hope nodded politely, but her attention continued to drift beyond the windows to where children no older than Catherine played in the dust between the neat rows of cabins that housed the plantation's enslaved families. Their laughter, bright and innocent despite their circumstances, created a poignant counterpoint to the adult conversations about productivity and profit that filled the morning air. When she finally found the courage to voice her observations about the possibility of establishing a proper school for these children, William's response was swift and decisively negative. "Education creates expectations that cannot be fulfilled within the current system," he said, though something in his eyes suggested the words came from habit and social conditioning rather than personal conviction. A contented workforce is a productive workforce, and productivity ensures everyone's survival. Yet as the days passed and Hope settled into the rhythms of plantation life, she began to notice contradictions in William's character that defied easy categorization. He knew the names of every enslaved person on the plantation, from the newest infant to the oldest grandparent, and he inquired regularly about sick children, family concerns, and personal welfare in ways that suggested genuine care rather than mere attention to valuable property. When families were sold or transferred to other plantations, he ensured that husbands, wives, and children remained together, a consideration that was far from universal among plantation owners, even those with reputations for enlightened management. These observations encouraged Hope to begin, tentatively and quietly, her own small acts of rebellion against the more dehumanizing aspects of the system. During her afternoon walks through the quarters, she began carrying a basket containing simple medical supplies and treats for the children, offering basic care for minor injuries and illnesses that might otherwise have gone untreated. When some of the younger children showed curiosity about the books she sometimes carried, she began reading aloud to small groups that gathered around her, sharing Bible stories and simple tales that could hardly be considered subversive, yet represented a kind of education that challenged the plantation's official policies. William's initial response to these activities was carefully neutral, observing from a distance but offering neither encouragement nor prohibition. Hope sensed that he was evaluating not just her actions, but their effects on plantation discipline and productivity, measuring her humanitarian impulses against the practical demands of maintaining order and profitability in an operation that supported hundreds of people and generated wealth that reached far beyond the boundaries of South Carolina. The transformation in his attitude was gradual but unmistakable. As weeks passed, William began joining Hope on her visits to the quarters, listening as she read to gathered families and watching as she tended to minor medical needs with supplies that had gradually expanded from her original simple basket to a proper medicine chest. His participation evolved from tolerance to support, and finally to something approaching admiration for her ability to improve conditions without disrupting the essential functions that kept the plantation operating successfully. When Hope suggested that allowing enslaved families to maintain small garden plots for their own use might improve both nutrition and morale, William not only agreed, but helped design a system that gave families a measure of economic independence through the sale of surplus vegetables in Charleston's markets. These small steps toward humanizing the system represented compromises that satisfied neither the most progressive critics of slavery nor the most conservative defenders of traditional plantation management, yet they created tangible improvements in daily life for people who had previously possessed few opportunities for self-determination. Could Hope's gentle influence continue to soften the harsh realities of plantation life, or would the fundamental contradictions of the system prove too deeply entrenched to permit meaningful change? Margaret Beauregard Ashford returned to Charleston society in the autumn of 1856 like a carefully orchestrated tempest, Her arrival from an extended European grand tour timed with the precision of a military campaign to coincide with the height of the social season. At 28, she possessed the kind of polished, sophisticated beauty that could only be achieved through careful cultivation and considerable expense. Golden hair arranged in the latest Parisian fashion, a complexion that spoke of protection from common labor and common concerns, and a wardrobe that represented the finest that London and Paris could offer to a woman of unlimited means and exacting taste. Margaret's reputation as Charleston's most desirable widow had only grown more lustrous during her 2-year absence from American society. Letters from mutual acquaintances had kept the local social circles informed of her triumphs in European capitals, where her combination of southern charm, substantial fortune, and perfect breeding had made her welcome in the most exclusive circles. Now she had returned with stories of presentation at European courts, friendships with titled ladies, and a sophistication that made other Charleston belles seem provincial by comparison. The confrontation that would reshape Hope's understanding of her situation came during the Rhett family's elaborate ball at their magnificent mansion on Legar Street. The house itself, built to showcase the wealth that rice and cotton had brought to one of Charleston's oldest families, provided a stage worthy of the drama that would unfold within its elegantly appointed rooms. Crystal chandeliers imported from Bohemia cast dancing light across walls hung with silk damask, while mirrors in gilded frames reflected the movement of guests whose jewels and gowns represented fortunes that most people could hardly imagine. Hope had retreated to the mansion's garden terrace, grateful for a moment's respite from the oppressive gaiety within, where conversations seemed to revolve endlessly around topics that felt increasingly meaningless in light of the serious matters that occupied her thoughts. The terrace itself offered a peaceful refuge, with jasmine and climbing roses, perfuming the night air, and the distant sound of harbour bells marking the passage of time with gentle melancholy. Margaret materialized beside her with the silent grace of a predator who had learned to move without disturbing her prey. Her midnight blue silk gown rustling softly as she positioned herself to take advantage of the moonlight that would flatter her carefully maintained complexion. Her approach had been planned with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate, choosing a moment when Hope was alone and vulnerable, separated from potential allies or witnesses who might complicate the delivery of carefully prepared revelations. "My dear Hope," Margaret's voice carried the honey-sweet venom that Southern ladies had perfected over generations of social warfare, each word precisely calibrated to convey sympathy while delivering maximum psychological damage. How absolutely refreshing to encounter someone so innocent navigating these treacherous social waters. Charleston society can be so terribly sophisticated for those unaccustomed to its complexities. What followed represented a masterclass in the art of character assassination disguised as concerned friendship. Margaret spoke with the authority of long acquaintance and intimate knowledge, dropping carefully chosen details about William's life and character that would have been impossible for a casual observer to know. She described shared memories from their youth, when both families had moved in the same elevated social circles, and mutual understanding that had been developing between them before her departure for Europe. With the skill of a surgeon wielding a scalpel, Margaret began to dissect Hope's assumptions about William's character and motivations. She spoke of his reputation for cold calculation in business dealings, his treatment of former romantic interests with polite indifference once they had served their purpose, and his ability to compartmentalize his life so completely that different aspects of his personality seemed to belong to entirely different men. But it was Margaret's final revelation that struck like lightning through Hope's carefully constructed understanding of the man she had begun to trust with her future. Speaking in tones of concerned friendship, with an expression of reluctant duty to share information that any true friend deserved to know, Margaret mentioned William's arrangement with a beautiful mulatto woman who lived in a discreet house in Charleston's French Quarter. The details that followed were delivered with surgical precision, each one designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability about malicious intent. Margaret described a relationship that had begun shortly after William's wife's death and had continued, despite his current courtship, suggesting a man capable of maintaining separate emotional lives with the same efficiency he brought to managing his business interests. According to Margaret's carefully constructed narrative, William visited this woman regularly, providing her with luxuries and protection in exchange for companionship that no respectable white woman could offer. The arrangement was supposedly well known among certain circles of Charleston society, tolerated because of William's wealth and position, but scandalous enough to destroy any white woman who became publicly associated with a man who maintained such relationships. The carriage ride back to the Blackwood mansion passed in suffocating silence, Hope's mind reeling with images she couldn't banish and questions she was afraid to ask. The familiar streets of Charleston, which had begun to feel like home during her weeks as William's guest, now seemed foreign and threatening, filled with secrets and relationships that she had been too naive to recognize. Every couple they passed on the sidewalks, every light glowing in bedroom windows, every sound of laughter from behind garden walls seemed to mock her innocence and confirm her worst fears about the man she had begun to trust. William noticed her distress immediately upon their return, his concern evident in the gentle way he handed her down from the carriage and the careful attention he paid to her every gesture and expression. His solicitude, which under other circumstances would have been comforting, now seemed potentially calculated, part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain her trust while concealing aspects of his character that would appall any decent woman. When Hope finally found the courage to confront him, they stood in his study surrounded by leather-bound books and family portraits that seemed to watch their drama unfold with the dispassionate interest of observers who had witnessed similar scenes play out over generations. The room itself, with its masculine furnishings and atmosphere of serious business, provided an appropriate backdrop for a conversation that would determine whether trust once given could survive the revelation of secrets that challenged everything Hope had believed about the man she was considering marrying. William's reaction to her questions surprised Hope, with its combination of relief and resignation, as if he had been expecting this confrontation and was grateful that secrets could finally be spoken aloud, rather than hidden beneath layers of social convention and polite deception. Instead of denial or anger, he showed the weary acceptance of a man who had learned that even the most innocent actions could be twisted into weapons by those who possessed the skill and motivation to destroy reputations. The truth, when it finally emerged through careful questioning and honest explanation, proved both more complex and more honorable than Margaret's poisonous suggestions had implied. The woman in question was indeed Celeste, a person of mixed racial heritage who lived under William's protection in a house he maintained in Charleston. But rather than being his mistress, she was the daughter of his late wife's personal maid, a young woman he had quietly freed after his wife's death, and whom he continued to protect from the dangers that faced attractive women of color in a society that offered them few legal protections. Celeste's mother had served William's wife with loyalty and devotion for more than 20 years, and her daughter had grown up in the Blackwood household as a companion to the white children, educated alongside them by tutors who had been instructed to treat all children in their care with equal attention and respect. When yellow fever had claimed both William's wife and Celeste's mother within days of each other, William had felt obligated to ensure the young woman's future security, providing her with freedom, education, and protection that would allow her to build an independent life. Their relationship was that of guardian and ward, rather than master and mistress, but William understood with painful clarity how such arrangements could be misinterpreted by those seeking to destroy reputations or advance their own interests. His visits to Celeste's residence were primarily for the purpose of ensuring her continued safety and prosperity, though he acknowledged that maintaining such a relationship required discretion that could easily be misrepresented as evidence of impropriety. Standing in the lamplight with shadows dancing around them, like visible manifestations of the doubts and fears that threatened to destroy their growing intimacy, William's explanation carried the weight of absolute honesty. Hope found herself looking into eyes that held no deception. Only the weary resignation of a man who had learned that good intentions could be twisted into evidence of corruption by those who wielded gossip and innuendo as weapons in the complex warfare of social position and personal advancement. Would Hope's faith in William's essential decency prove strong enough to withstand the poison of Margaret's revelations, or would doubt, once planted, grow until it destroyed the trust that had been so carefully cultivated between them? December descended upon Blackwood Plantation with the gentle insistence of a prayer finally answered, bringing with it the ancient rhythms and sacred traditions that had marked the Christmas season for countless generations of families both black and white. The great house seemed to glow from within, its windows casting golden rectangles of warmth across grounds where frost sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early morning light. Throughout the quarters, families prepared for the 3 precious days of celebration, that tradition granted even to those who possessed nothing in this world but hope for something better in the next. The weeks leading up to Christmas had provided Hope with her deepest satisfaction since arriving at Blackwood, as she threw herself into planning celebrations that would bring joy to every member of the plantation community. Working alongside Bessie, the plantation's head cook, whose reputation for culinary excellence was legendary throughout the Ashley River Valley, Hope organized feasts that would ensure every family had enough to eat, and small gifts that would bring smiles to children's faces on Christmas morning. This was work that brought Hope a sense of purpose and accomplishment that her previous life had never provided. At Magnolia Grove, her responsibilities had been largely ornamental, arranging flowers, practicing music, and preparing for social occasions that now seemed frivolous compared to the meaningful labor of ensuring that hundreds of people could celebrate the birth of their savior with dignity and joy. Every hour spent organizing food distribution, every moment devoted to wrapping small presents for children who had never owned anything they could call their own. Every effort to coordinate celebrations that would bridge the artificial divisions created by slavery felt like steps toward becoming the woman she was meant to be. William observed these preparations with growing admiration, watching as Hope transformed from the elegant but essentially decorative young lady he had first met into a woman whose every action was informed by compassion and directed toward the welfare of others. Her attention to detail, her sensitivity to the needs and feelings of people society taught her to regard as property, and her ability to organize complex logistics while maintaining focus on individual human dignity revealed qualities that no amount of social position or inherited wealth could provide. The plantation chapel, built by William's grandfather as a visible symbol of the family's commitment to caring for souls as well as bodies, had been transformed for the Christmas service into a bower of natural beauty that rivaled any cathedral. Pine boughs and holly gathered from the plantation's own forests filled the air with fragrances that spoke of God's provision through the abundance of His creation, while candles provided light that seemed to make the simple wooden interior glow with sacred purpose. As Hope arranged the final touches on the altar, placing garlands and candles with the same careful attention she brought to every task, she became aware of William's presence before she heard his footsteps on the worn wooden floor. He approached with unusual hesitancy, as if each step required careful consideration, his customary confidence replaced by something more vulnerable and uncertain. In his hands, he carried a small velvet box that seemed to contain the weight of both their futures, along with the hopes and fears that had been building between them through months of careful courtship and gradual understanding. The box itself was clearly an heirloom, its worn velvet and tarnished silver fittings, speaking of generations of love and loss, joy and heartbreak, all crystallized into this moment of choice and commitment. Hope, his voice carried none of its usual commanding authority, revealing instead the uncertainty of a man venturing into emotional territory where wealth and social position provided no guidance or protection. These past months have taught me something I believed I had forgotten, that the human heart follows no logic except its own, and that love, when it comes, transforms everything it touches. What followed was not the calculated proposal of convenience that had brought them together, but something entirely different, a declaration of feelings that had grown from practical arrangement into genuine affection, and from affection into something approaching love. William spoke with halting honesty about how Hope's presence had changed, not just his household management, but his entire understanding of what life could offer beyond mere financial success and social approval. He described watching her teach children to read, and seeing in her face a light that no amount of gold could purchase, observing her tend to sick family members, and recognizing in her actions a kind of grace that challenged his assumptions about human nature and social obligation. Her influence had spread through the plantation like beneficial rain after drought, improving not just working conditions, but relationships between people who had previously interacted only within the rigid constraints of master and slave. When he opened the box to reveal his grandmother's ring, a circle of diamonds mined from the mountains of North Carolina and set in gold refined from streams that flowed through the upcountry, Hope saw not just precious stones but generations of family history compressed into a symbol of commitment and continuity. The ring had graced the hand of a woman who had helped build Blackwood Plantation from wilderness, who had raised children and grandchildren to understand both their privileges and their responsibilities, and who had faced the challenges of frontier life with the same determination that Hope was learning to bring to the moral complexities of antebellum society. Hope's acceptance came not with words, but with trembling fingers extended toward his steady hands, a gesture that spoke more eloquently than any verbal declaration of her willingness to trust her future to this man who had proven himself worthy of such trust. As William slipped the ring onto her finger, the chapel bells began to chime the hour, and outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, a meteorological rarity in the South Carolina Lowcountry that the enslaved families would later claim as a sign of heaven's blessing on their union. Standing together in the candlelit chapel, with the scent of pine and promises filling the air around them, Hope and William discovered that love built on respect and nurtured by shared purpose could indeed grow strong enough to support the weight of an uncertain future. Their engagement represented more than the union of two individuals. It symbolized the possibility that even institutions as entrenched as plantation slavery might be reformed through the patient application of Christian principles and human compassion. The announcement of their engagement, made to the assembled families during the Christmas Eve service, was received with genuine joy that transcended the artificial barriers of race and legal status. For people who had watched Hope's gentle influence gradually improve their daily lives, her marriage to their master represented hope that beneficial changes would continue and expand under her permanent influence. Could their love, blessed in sacred space and witnessed by a community that had learned to trust Hope's goodness, survive the elaborate social rituals that would transform their private commitment into a public institution? Spring arrived in Charleston during the early weeks of 1857, with the triumphant grace of a queen reclaiming her rightful throne, trading winter's brief but sharp cold for the golden warmth that made the peninsula city a stage worthy of the most elaborate social productions the South could imagine. The air itself seemed to sparkle with anticipation, carrying mingled fragrances of tea olive, Confederate jasmine, and climbing roses that transformed every garden and courtyard into a natural perfumery designed to enhance the romance of the approaching wedding season. St. Philip's Church, where generations of Charleston's most distinguished families had exchanged vows beneath the blessing of stained glass windows and ancient prayers, had been transformed into a cathedral of flowers that would have rivaled any European royal wedding. White camellias, forced into early bloom through careful greenhouse cultivation, cascaded from every pillar and archway, while jasmine vines created living garlands that perfumed the air with an almost intoxicating sweetness. The altar itself had been rebuilt as a bower of white roses and orange blossoms, creating a focal point that drew the eye irresistibly toward the spot where Hope and William would pledge their lives to each other. The weeks of preparation had tested every resource of Charleston's most skilled artisans and craftspeople. Hope's wedding gown, created by Madame Rousseau, the city's most exclusive dressmaker, had required the labor of 12 seamstresses working in shifts for 6 weeks to complete. The silk had been shipped directly from Lyon, France, chosen specifically for its lustrous quality and perfect weight, while the handmade lace that bordered the train had been created by cloistered nuns in Belgium, whose needlework was legendary throughout Europe. The gown itself was a masterpiece of understated elegance, cut in the latest French fashion, with a fitted bodice that emphasized Hope's slender waist and a skirt that flowed from her hips like captured moonlight. The sleeves, tight-fitting to the wrist and adorned with tiny pearl buttons, spoke of both modesty and sophistication, while the neckline, bordered with the precious lace, framed Hope's face with an ethereal beauty that seemed to glow from within. Hope stood in the bride's room adjoining the church, her reflection multiplied in mirrors that surrounded her like approving witnesses to her transformation from uncertain girl to confident woman. Catherine and their cousin Eleanor, serving as her attendants, fluttered around her with the nervous energy of songbirds preparing for flight. Their gowns of palest yellow silk, chosen to complement the abundance of flowers, without competing with the bride's luminous beauty. Outside the church, the cobblestone streets had been transformed into a showcase of low-country prosperity and social distinction. Carriages representing the finest families from Charleston to Savannah lined the streets like an exhibition of wealth and taste, their occupants dressed in costumes that represented the pinnacle of American fashion and European sophistication. Governor James Hopkins Adams himself would attend the ceremony, lending his political presence to a social event that was being discussed in drawing rooms from Richmond to New Orleans. Yet for all the grandeur of the public occasion, Hope found her thoughts turning inward to the quiet moments she and William had shared in recent weeks. Conversations by candlelight, where they had planned not just their wedding, but their life together. Walks through gardens heavy with spring blooms, where they had discussed their hopes for the future. Stolen kisses that spoke of growing intimacy and deepening trust that had transformed a marriage of convenience into something approaching a love match. The transformation in their relationship had been gradual but unmistakable. What had begun as mutual respect and practical compatibility had evolved into genuine affection as they discovered shared values and complementary strengths. William's initial appreciation for Hope's beauty and accomplishments had deepened into admiration for her intelligence and compassion, while Hope's gratitude for his rescue of her family had grown into something much more personal and emotionally satisfying. Their physical relationship, carefully constrained by the proprieties that governed proper courtship, had nevertheless revealed a mutual attraction that promised well for the intimacies of marriage. William's kisses, stolen during chaperoned walks or exchanged in moments of privacy that social convention allowed, spoke of passion held in careful check rather than mere duty or calculated affection. Hope had discovered in herself a capacity for desire that her sheltered upbringing had never prepared her to recognize, much less understand or manage. The ceremony itself unfolded with the precise choreography that Southern society had perfected over generations of practice in the arts of gracious living and public display. As Hope walked down the aisle on Samuel's proudly offering arm, she was aware of hundreds of eyes observing every detail of her appearance and deportment, yet her own attention was focused entirely on William, waiting at the altar, with an expression that transformed his usually composed features into something approaching wonder. He stood there in his morning coat of finest black wool, his waistcoat of ivory silk, and his perfectly tied cravat, representing everything that was most admirable in Southern manhood. Successful, honorable, and blessed with the kind of natural authority that commanded respect without demanding submission. Yet Hope saw beneath the public facade to the man who had shared his doubts and fears with her, who had proven himself capable of change and growth under her gentle influence, and who had learned to value her opinions as well as her beauty. The Episcopal service, conducted by Bishop Davis with all the solemnity such an occasion demanded, seemed to create a sacred bubble around the bride and groom that held the watching world at bay. The ancient words of commitment and blessing, spoken in the presence of God and witnessed by their community, transformed what had begun as a business arrangement into something sacred and permanent. When William lifted her veil to claim their first kiss as husband and wife, Hope tasted both triumph and transformation. The woman who had stood in her father's study months earlier, facing financial ruin with uncertain courage, had become a bride whose love had been freely given and joyfully received. More than that, she had become a partner in an enterprise that extended far beyond their personal happiness to encompass the welfare of hundreds of people whose lives would be shaped by the choices they made together. The reception at Blackwood Plantation showcased the full splendor of antebellum hospitality at its most magnificent. The great house and its surrounding grounds had been transformed into a vision of earthly paradise, with every surface that could hold flowers adorned with arrangements that represented the finest work of Charleston's most skilled florists. Long tables groaned beneath the weight of traditional Southern delicacies, prepared by teams of cooks, working under Bessie's expert supervision. Roasted pig and fowl, rice dishes that showcased the culinary traditions brought from Africa and refined in Carolina kitchens, sweet potato pudding and syllabub, along with confections that represented the latest refinements of European pastry arts. The celebration continued long into the evening, with guests dancing on the wide piazzas beneath lanterns that turned the night into an enchanted garden. Musicians provided entertainment that ranged from classical selections suitable for formal dancing to the more spirited melodies that encouraged the kind of joyful celebration that marked the best Southern social occasions. As the evening wore on, and the last guests departed in their carriages with wheels crunching softly over oyster shell drives that led back toward Charleston, Hope and William stood together on the steps of what was now truly their home, married in fact as well as name, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, with the strength that only true partnership could provide. How would their marriage weather the gathering storms that were already visible on the political horizon, and what legacy would their love create for the generations yet to be born? The honeymoon weeks passed in blessed isolation on Kiowa Island, where the Blackwood family maintained a summer retreat that offered complete privacy from the expectations and observations of Charleston society. The house itself, a graceful structure built to capture ocean breezes while providing shelter from summer storms, sat among ancient oaks and palmettos that had witnessed centuries of tides and seasons. Here, away from the complex social dynamics that governed plantation life, Hope and William could discover each other without the weight of public scrutiny or the demands of managing a community of hundreds. The days established their own gentle rhythm, mornings spent walking the pristine beach where only their footprints marked the sand, afternoons reading together in the shade of wide piazzas while ocean breezes provided natural cooling, evenings watching spectacular sunsets that painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed created specifically for lovers. These were the first weeks of Hope's adult life, when her time belonged entirely to herself and the man she had chosen to share her future. Their conversations during these precious weeks ranged far beyond the practical matters that had necessarily dominated their courtship. William revealed aspects of his character that the demands of business and social position had forced him to suppress, a love of poetry that extended beyond the conventionally admired classics to include contemporary works that challenged traditional assumptions about society and human nature, a fascination with new agricultural techniques that might improve both productivity and working conditions, and dreams of travel that would allow him to observe how other societies managed the complex relationships between different races and economic classes. Hope discovered in herself intellectual appetites that her education had awakened but never fully satisfied. William's library, extensive and eclectic, provided access to books that proper young ladies were not encouraged to read, including works of philosophy, political economy, and social reform that opened new worlds of thought and possibility. Their discussions of these challenging texts revealed mental compatibility that complemented their growing physical intimacy and emotional attachment. The physical dimension of their marriage unfolded with the same gradual grace that had marked their emotional connection. William's experience, gained during his first marriage, allowed him to guide Hope through the mysteries of marital intimacy with patience and tenderness that transformed what might have been merely duty into genuine pleasure. Hope discovered in herself a capacity for passion that her sheltered upbringing had never prepared her to recognize, finding in her husband's arms a completion that made their union feel inevitable rather than merely convenient. When they returned to Blackwood Plantation, as the summer heat began to build toward its seasonal peak, Hope found herself viewing her new home with eyes sharpened by weeks of intimate conversation about their hopes and plans for the future. The complex operation that supported more than 300 people now seemed less overwhelming and more like an opportunity to put into practice the ideals they had discussed in theoretical terms during their honeymoon retreat. Hope's role as mistress of the plantation expanded naturally from the charitable activities she had begun during her courtship. Under Bessie's patient guidance, she learned the intricate choreography required to feed and clothe hundreds of people whose welfare depended on her organizational skills and attention to detail. The daily distribution of rations, the management of clothing allocation, the coordination of medical care for minor illnesses and injuries, all of these responsibilities required abilities that her formal education had never addressed, but which she discovered she possessed in abundance. More challenging, but ultimately more satisfying, was her work to improve educational opportunities for the enslaved children. What had begun as informal reading lessons during afternoon walks gradually evolved into a proper schoolhouse in a converted outbuilding and staffed by Hope herself, along with two of the more educated house servants who could assist with basic arithmetic and rudimentary geography. The curriculum was carefully designed to satisfy even conservative critics, heavy emphasis on Bible study and moral instruction, practical skills that would improve plantation productivity, and just enough literacy to enable students to read scriptures and understand written instructions. William's support for these educational initiatives went beyond mere tolerance to active encouragement and practical assistance. He provided funding for books and supplies, arranged for the construction of proper classroom facilities, and gradually extended the program to include adult education sessions in the evenings when fieldwork was completed. His business correspondence with other progressive planters throughout the South began to include discussions of labor management techniques that emphasized incentives rather than punishment, education rather than ignorance, and family stability rather than the constant threat of separation. The transformation was not without resistance from some quarters. Several of the plantation's overseers expressed concern about coddling enslaved workers, arguing that education and improved conditions would create discontent rather than gratitude. Some members of Charleston society whispered about Hope's unfortunate enthusiasms and William's dangerous departure from traditional plantation management practices. Anonymous letters warned that such innovations were undermining the social order that protected white supremacy and Southern civilization. Yet the evidence of success was impossible to ignore. Cotton production increased rather than decreased under the new management approaches, as workers who felt more secure and better treated applied themselves more diligently to their tasks. The incidents of minor rebellions, theft, and malingering that plagued many plantations decreased dramatically as Hope's reforms created genuine incentives for cooperation and productivity. When neighboring planters visited Blackwood to observe these innovations firsthand, most left convinced that humanitarian treatment was not only morally superior, but economically advantageous. Hope's pregnancy, which became apparent during the autumn months, added new urgency to their discussions about the kind of world they wanted to create for their children. As her condition became visible, she found herself moving more slowly through her daily routines but thinking more quickly about fundamental questions of justice and responsibility that would shape the next generation's understanding of right and wrong. The conversations between husband and wife took on new philosophical depth as they contemplated bringing children into a society built on contradictions they were only beginning to fully understand. How could they raise sons and daughters to be both proud of their heritage and ashamed of its foundation in human bondage? How could they prepare their children to inherit positions of authority while teaching them to question the assumptions that had created such positions? How could they maintain their economic prosperity while transitioning to labor systems that would be more just but potentially less profitable? These questions had no easy answers, but William and Hope found that the process of grappling with them together strengthened rather than strained their marriage. Each brought different perspectives and insights to their discussions. William's practical experience with business management and Hope's intuitive understanding of human relationships, creating a partnership that was more effective than either could have been individually. As their first child prepared to enter a world where slavery still ruled, but change was clearly coming, would Hope and William succeed in creating conditions that would allow their family to prosper while maintaining their moral integrity? The winter of 1857 brought more than seasonal cold to the Carolina Lowcountry. It carried with it news from the wider world that penetrated even the most carefully insulated corners of Southern society, like ice forming in the cracks of stone. Letters from relatives in Virginia and Kentucky spoke of increasing tensions between North and South that were making normal social and business relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. Newspapers carried reports of debates in Congress that grew more heated with each passing week, while private correspondence from business associates in New York and Boston revealed growing hostility toward Southern institutions that made future cooperation uncertain. William found himself drawn reluctantly into political discussions that had previously remained on the margins of his attention. As one of the largest cotton producers in South Carolina, his opinions carried weight in the councils where decisions affecting the state's future were being made. Yet his well-known sympathy for gradual emancipation placed him in an increasingly isolated position among peers who viewed any questioning of the slavery system as tantamount to treason against Southern civilization. The Charleston dinner parties and club meetings that had once provided pleasant opportunities for social connection now became forums for increasingly bitter debates about secession, states' rights, and the future of the Union. Old friendships fractured along lines that seemed to grow deeper and more irreconcilable with every exchange of views, while new alliances formed around political positions that demanded absolute loyalty and brooked no compromise. Hope watched her husband struggle with the growing tension between his personal convictions and his loyalty to the state and region that had shaped his identity. During their evening conversations, he shared his fears that the moderate position they had tried to stake out was becoming untenable as both North and South moved toward more extreme positions that would make peaceful resolution impossible. "Sometimes I feel as though we're standing in the middle of a river that's rising on both sides," he told her one evening as they sat on the veranda, watching little Charles play with wooden blocks that his father had carved with his own hands. "The current is carrying us toward rapids we can see coming, but seem powerless to avoid." Hope's pregnancy progressed through the cooler months with the careful attention of both. Dr. Ravenel from Charleston and Aunt Chloe, the plantation's wise woman, whose knowledge of herbs and birthing had saved countless mothers and babies over her 60 years of service. The combination of trained medical expertise and traditional folk wisdom created a support system that made Hope feel confident about the approaching birth, even as the political situation created anxiety about the world her child would inherit. As Hope's condition became more apparent, she found herself the object of increased attention and solicitude from every member of the plantation community. Enslaved women who had borne and raised their own children under far more difficult circumstances now competed to offer advice, assistance, and the kind of emotional support that transcended the artificial barriers created by law and custom. Their genuine affection for Hope, earned through months of kindness and respect, created a network of care that made her feel both protected and connected to a larger community of women who understood the profound transformation that motherhood would bring. The news of Lincoln's election reached Charleston on a November day when Spanish moss hung motionless in air, so still it seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the explosion that everyone knew was coming. The immediate response throughout the city was a mixture of outrage and excitement. That reminded Hope uncomfortably of the atmosphere that preceded a duel, sense that honor demanded satisfaction regardless of the year, consequences for all involved. Mass meetings were called, speeches were made, and resolutions were passed that moved South Carolina steadily toward a confrontation that cooler heads recognized would be disastrous for everyone involved. William attended these gatherings as his position in society demanded, but he returned home each evening more troubled than hopeful about the direction events were taking. When the Ordinance of Secession passed in December, with celebration in the streets of Charleston that rivaled any 4th of July festivities, William found himself faced with an impossible choice. His business interests, family connections, and genuine love for South Carolina pulled him toward supporting the Confederacy that was rapidly forming. But his moral convictions and his understanding of economic realities suggested that secession would ultimately prove disastrous for everyone involved, regardless of their position on slavery. The compromise that he and Hope reached, after hours of difficult conversation and painful soul-searching, reflected both their practical nature and their commitment to protecting the people who depended on them. They would remain neutral as long as possible, focusing their energies on completing the transition to free labor before war could disrupt their carefully laid plans. The plantation would continue operating as a model of what Southern society might become if it could evolve beyond its dependence on forced labor, without destroying the economic foundations that supported white and black families alike. But neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain as Confederate authorities began pressuring all able-bodied men to join military units being formed throughout the state. William's age and family responsibilities provided some protection from conscription, but social pressure from neighbors and business associates created a different kind of coercion that proved harder to resist without seeming unpatriotic or cowardly. The birth of their daughter Catherine Hope in January 1861, during one of the coldest winters in recent memory, provided temporary distraction from political turmoil that seemed to be spinning beyond anyone's control. The baby arrived healthy and strong after a labor that was mercifully brief, bringing joy to a household that desperately needed reasons for hope about the future. Little Catherine's arrival seemed to energize rather than exhaust her mother, as if the successful completion of her first childbearing experience had provided Hope with new confidence in her own strength and capabilities. Within weeks of the birth, she was back to her full schedule of plantation management activities, now with the added motivation of wanting to create a better world for her daughter to inherit. As war clouds gathered with increasing intensity, would the Blackwoods find a way to protect their growing family and their moral principles, or would they be forced to choose between conscience and survival in a conflict that promised to destroy the world they had known? Little Charles William Blackwood entered the world on a May morning when the air itself seemed to shimmer with golden possibility, as if nature had conspired to welcome this particular child with special grace and benediction. The birth occurred in the master bedroom of Blackwood Plantation, with morning light streaming through windows that faced east toward the sunrise and the promise of new beginnings. Hope's labor, attended by both Dr. Ravenel's professional expertise and Aunt Chloe's ancient wisdom, proved mercifully brief yet intense, culminating in the arrival of a son whose vigorous cry announced his intention to make his presence known throughout the household. When Hope first held her son in her arms, feeling the warm weight of new life against her breast, she experienced a transformation so profound that it seemed to rearrange not just her priorities, but her very understanding of what it meant to be human. This tiny being, with his perfectly formed fingers and toes, his soft dark hair that reminded her of William's, and his eyes that would eventually reveal the intelligence and determination he had inherited from both parents, represented not just the continuation of family lineage, but the embodiment of hope for a better future. William's reaction to fatherhood surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. This man who had commanded respect through authority and maintained distance as a tool of leadership melted into tenderness the moment he touched his son's tiny fingers. The transformation was so complete and so immediate that even Aunt Chloe, who had witnessed the birth of dozens of children over her long life, commented on the unusual depth of connection between father and child. He spent hours in the nursery that had been prepared with meticulous care in the weeks leading up to the birth, reading aloud from books of poetry and philosophy, as if the infant could absorb wisdom through the sound of his father's voice. When business demanded his attention elsewhere on the plantation, he frequently carried little Charles with him, introducing his son to the land he would one day inherit and the people whose lives would be shaped by his decisions. The baby's presence created ripples of joy throughout the plantation community that transcended the artificial barriers of race and legal status. Enslaved women who had borne their own children under far more difficult circumstances smiled more readily when Hope passed with Charles in her arms, while field hands who had previously maintained careful emotional distance found themselves pausing in their work to watch William bounce his son on his knee during evening walks through the quarters. There was something universal about the joy of new life that created moments of shared humanity, temporarily dissolving the complex tensions that slavery had created between people who lived and worked in such close proximity yet remained separated by laws and customs that defined them as fundamentally different types of beings. In these moments, Hope glimpsed the possibility of relationships based on mutual respect rather than legal domination, human connection rather than economic calculation. As Charles grew from helpless infant to alert and increasingly responsive baby, his development became a source of daily wonder and entertainment for his parents. Every smile, every new sound, every sign of emerging personality was celebrated and discussed as if no previous baby in the history of the world had ever achieved such remarkable milestones. William, whose own childhood had been marked by the formal distance that characterized relationships between upper-class parents and their children, was determined that his son would know from birth that he was loved unconditionally and valued for himself rather than merely as an heir to family fortune. Hope's recovery from childbirth proceeded smoothly, aided by the excellent care she received from both medical professionals and the community of women who had adopted her welfare as their personal responsibility. Within weeks of Charles's birth, she was back to her full schedule of plantation management activities, though now with a powerful new motivation for the reforms she and William were implementing. The presence of their son added urgency to discussions about transitioning from slave labor to a system that would allow their child to inherit authority based on competence and character rather than the accident of race and birth. They could not bear the thought of Charles growing up to command the involuntary service of other human beings, yet they also understood that changes implemented too quickly could destroy the economic foundation that allowed them to provide security for their growing family and the hundreds of people who depended on the plantation for their survival. The solution emerged through patient negotiation with individual families, offering freedom in exchange for continued residence and work under fair wages and decent living conditions. The first family to accept this arrangement was Old Ben and Maisie, whose grandchildren had been among Hope's first pupils in the plantation school and whose long service had earned them the respect and trust of everyone in the community. Old Ben, whose age and wisdom made him a natural spokesman for the enslaved community, approached the negotiations with the careful dignity of a man who understood that this opportunity might never come again. At nearly 70 years old, he had lived through enough broken promises and disappointed hopes to be skeptical of arrangements that seemed too good to be true, yet he was also wise enough to recognize genuine change when he encountered it. The terms they eventually agreed upon were unprecedented in the Carolina Lowcountry: immediate legal freedom for Ben's entire extended family, continued residence in improved housing that they would eventually be able to purchase, wages that would allow them to save money for the first time in their lives, an education for their children and grandchildren that would prepare them for full participation in a free society. When the legal papers were signed in William's study, with Dr. Ravenel serving as witness and Hope present to represent the family's commitment to honoring the agreement, old Ben's reaction was a mixture of joy, gratitude, and lingering disbelief that such a transformation was actually possible. His weathered hands shook slightly as he signed his name, a skill acquired through Hope's adult education classes, to the document that made him and his family legally free for the first time in their lives. The transition went so smoothly that other families began requesting similar arrangements, creating a gradual transformation of the plantation's labor system that attracted attention from throughout the region. By Christmas of 1859, nearly a third of the plantation's workforce had accepted freedom under what neighboring planters began calling the Blackwood system, with varying degrees of admiration, skepticism, and concern about the implications for their own operations. The freed families lived in substantially improved housing that featured better ventilation, more space, and small gardens where they could grow vegetables for their own use or sale in Charleston's markets. Their children attended an expanded school that now included basic arithmetic, geography, and practical skills that would prepare them for economic independence, while adult education classes in the evenings helped parents develop the literacy and numeracy skills necessary for managing their new freedom responsibly. Would this remarkable experiment in gradual emancipation prove sustainable as political tensions increased throughout the South? Or would external pressures force the Blackwoods to abandon their progressive approach to labor relations? The presidential election of 1860 descended upon South Carolina like a fever that no amount of Charleston's legendary hospitality could break, transforming even the most routine social gatherings into forums for increasingly bitter political debate. William found himself drawn reluctantly into discussions that grew more heated and divisive with each passing week, as old friendships fractured along ideological lines that seemed to deepen with every exchange of views, and former allies became opponents, separated by philosophical differences that appeared irreconcilable. At the jockey club meetings that had once provided pleasant opportunities for discussing horses, hunting, and business, conversations now turned inevitably to secession and what it might mean for the state's economic and social fabric. The St. Cecilia Society gatherings, traditionally devoted to music, dancing, and the refined pleasures of Charleston's cultural elite, became battlegrounds where competing visions of Southern civilization clashed with increasing intensity and diminishing civility. William's known sympathies for gradual emancipation and his implementation of progressive labor policies at Blackwood Plantation placed him in an increasingly isolated position among peers who viewed any questioning of the slavery system as evidence of dangerous radicalism that threatened the very foundations of their world. His attempts to argue for moderate positions that might preserve both the Union and Southern interests were met with suspicion and hostility from men who had once considered him a trusted friend and valuable business associate. The social pressure was intense and personally painful, as William found himself excluded from private gatherings where political strategies were discussed and important business decisions were made. Former associates began avoiding him at public events, while new acquaintances approached him with the cautious wariness reserved for men whose loyalty to Southern principles was considered questionable at best. Hope watched her husband struggle with the growing tension between his personal convictions and his loyalty to the state and region that had shaped his identity and provided the foundation for his prosperity. During their evening conversations, as they sat on the veranda with baby Charles playing at their feet and the sounds of the quarters drifting across the grounds like a gentle symphony of community life, William shared his fears that the moderate position they had tried to stake out was becoming untenable. "The center cannot hold," he told her one evening, quoting Yeats, while watching the sunset over cotton fields where free and enslaved laborers worked side by side in an arrangement that was becoming increasingly controversial. "Both sides are moving toward positions that will make compromise impossible, and men like me will be forced to choose between principles that have defined our entire understanding of right and wrong." The news of Lincoln's election reached Charleston on a November day when the Spanish moss hung motionless in air so still it seemed the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the explosion that everyone knew was coming, but no one seemed able to prevent. The immediate response throughout the city was a mixture of outrage and excitement that reminded Hope uncomfortably of the atmosphere that preceded a formal duel, a sense that honor demanded satisfaction regardless of the consequences for all parties involved. Mass meetings were organized with military precision, speeches were delivered with the passion of evangelical sermons, and resolutions were passed that moved South Carolina steadily toward a confrontation that thoughtful observers recognized would be disastrous for everyone involved, regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. The rhetoric grew more extreme with each passing day, as politicians and newspaper editors competed to demonstrate their loyalty to Southern principles through increasingly inflammatory language that made peaceful resolution seem not just unlikely but somehow cowardly and unpatriotic. William attended these gatherings as his position in society demanded, representing one of the state's largest cotton-producing enterprises and maintaining the appearance of civic engagement that was expected from men of his class and wealth. Yet he returned home each evening more troubled than hopeful about the direction events were taking, sharing with Hope his growing conviction that the state was rushing toward a precipice that would destroy much of what they had all worked so hard to build. When the Ordinance of Secession passed in December, amid celebrations in the streets of Charleston that rivaled any 4th of July festivities in their intensity and widespread participation, William found himself faced with an impossible choice between competing loyalties that had previously seemed compatible but now demanded exclusive allegiance. His business interests, family connections, and genuine love for South Carolina pulled him towards supporting the Confederacy that was rapidly forming around principles of state sovereignty and white supremacy. But his moral convictions, strengthened through months of implementing more humane labor policies, and his understanding of economic realities, gained through extensive correspondence with business associates throughout the United States and Europe, suggested that secession would ultimately prove disastrous for everyone involved, regardless of their position on the slavery question or their loyalty to Southern traditions. The compromise that he and Hope reached, after hours of difficult conversation and painful soul-searching that tested their marriage in ways they had never anticipated, reflected both their practical nature and their commitment to protecting the people who depended on them for survival and security. They would remain neutral as long as circumstances permitted, focusing their energies on completing the transition to free labor before war could disrupt their carefully laid plans or force them to abandon reforms that had already improved the lives of hundreds of people. The plantation would continue operating as a model of what Southern society might become if it could evolve beyond its dependence on forced labor without destroying the economic foundations that supported both white and black families. This middle path required enormous moral courage, as it satisfied neither the demands of Confederate patriotism nor the expectations of abolitionist ideology, leaving them vulnerable to criticism from both sides of an increasingly polarized conflict. The challenges of maintaining neutrality became apparent almost immediately as Confederate authorities began pressuring all able-bodied men to join military units being formed throughout the state. William's age and family responsibilities provided some protection from formal conscription, but social pressure from neighbors and business associates created a different kind of coercion that proved harder to resist without appearing unpatriotic or cowardly. Anonymous letters began arriving at the plantation, some accusing William of disloyalty to the Confederate cause, others threatening violence against his family if he continued to coddle enslaved workers who should be contributing to the war effort. The pressure was relentless and increasingly personal, forcing William and Hope to consider the possibility that their principled neutrality might ultimately prove impossible to maintain. Could their commitment to gradual reform survive the intense pressures of a society preparing for war, or would they be forced to choose between their convictions and their safety in a conflict that was rapidly destroying the moderate middle ground they had tried to occupy? The bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, marked not merely the beginning of military hostilities, but the end of the world that Hope and William had known and the idealistic future they had been working so carefully to create. The sound of cannon fire rolling across Charleston Harbor like thunder that refused to break reached even Blackwood Plantation, 20 miles up the Ashley River, carrying with it the knowledge that peaceful solutions were no longer possible and that every family in the South would be forced to choose sides in a conflict that would reshape American society. William's response to the attack was characteristic of the man Hope had learned to love and respect, thoughtful rather than reactive, principled rather than merely expedient, and focused primarily on protecting those who depended on him rather than advancing political positions that might prove costly to maintain. While his neighbors rushed to form volunteer companies and prepared for what everyone assumed would be a brief and glorious conflict that would vindicate Southern principles and secure Confederate independence, William quietly accelerated his plans for completing the transition to free labor. He understood, with the clarity that comes from studying markets and economic trends, that war would make such changes infinitely more difficult, if not impossible, to implement. Confederate authorities would demand total mobilization of all available resources, including enslaved labor that might be impressed for military construction projects or factory work that would separate families and destroy the careful community, relationships that had made gradual emancipation possible at Blackwood. The plantation's freed families faced this uncertain future with a mixture of hope and anxiety that mirrored their former master's own complex feelings about the approaching conflict. Freedom that had been granted voluntarily through legal processes might be revoked by military authorities, who viewed any deviation from traditional slavery as potentially treasonous or subversive to the Confederate war effort. Hope worked tirelessly to create documentation that would legally protect the freed family's status, while William used his influence with local officials to ensure that these families would not be forced back into bondage by overzealous Confederate recruiters or impressed for military service that would destroy their newly won independence. The legal paperwork was complex and required careful attention to details that could mean the difference between continued freedom and return to slavery. As the war's demands intensified throughout 1861 and 1862, Blackwood Plantation found itself increasingly isolated from the outside world that had once provided markets for its cotton and sources for manufactured goods that made plantation life comfortable and efficient. Confederate requisitions of food and supplies strained resources that had once seemed abundant, while the Union blockade of Charleston Harbor cut off access to the imported goods that had made antebellum life so gracious and refined. Yet in some ways, this enforced isolation brought Hope and William closer together, creating an intimate world where their love could deepen without the distractions of social obligations and political pressures that had previously demanded so much of their time and attention. They discovered that their partnership, tested by the practical challenges of managing a large agricultural operation under wartime conditions, had grown stronger rather than weaker under pressure. Their children provided both motivation and comfort during the increasingly dark months when news from the outside world grew more grim with each passing report. Charles, now walking confidently and beginning to speak in complete sentences, seemed to absorb the tensions around him with the sensitivity that often marks intelligent children who are too young to understand events, but old enough to sense their parents' anxiety. Catherine, still an infant but growing rapidly and developing her own distinct personality, offered the simple joy that comes from watching new life unfold its possibilities, even in the midst of destruction and uncertainty. Her smiles and laughter provided moments of pure happiness that reminded her parents why their struggle to create a better world was worth the sacrifices it demanded. Hope's role in managing the plantation expanded dramatically as William's attention was increasingly demanded by Confederate authorities who viewed his resources as essential to the war effort and his loyalty as questionable due to his well-known sympathies for gradual emancipation. She proved remarkably capable of maintaining both productivity and morale among workers who understood that their unusual circumstances made them vulnerable to forces beyond anyone's control. The most severe test of their principles came in the winter of 1862, when Confederate officers arrived at the plantation with orders to impress able-bodied slaves for military construction projects around Charleston Harbor. William's careful explanation of his workforce's legal status as free laborers met with skepticism and barely concealed hostility from men who viewed such arrangements as barely disguised treason against Confederate principles. The confrontation that followed tested every aspect of William's character and Hope's courage. The Confederate officers, led by a young colonel whose enthusiasm for the cause exceeded his understanding of legal complexities, demanded immediate compliance with their requisition orders and threatened to arrest William as a Union sympathizer if he continued to obstruct their mission. William's response was calm but uncompromising. He produced legal documents proving the freed status of his workers, cited South Carolina law protecting the property rights of citizens, and quietly reminded the officers that his family's loyalty to the state preceded the Confederacy by several generations. When these arguments failed to persuade men who were more interested in meeting quotas than respecting legal niceties, William was forced to rely on political connections and personal reputation to prevent the immediate seizure of workers whose freedom had been so carefully negotiated. The resolution came only after Dr. Ravenel and several prominent Charleston businessmen intervened on William's behalf, vouching for his character and arguing that forced labor policies would ultimately harm the Confederate cause by alienating moderate supporters who might otherwise provide crucial assistance. The freed workers remained at Blackwood, but William understood that his family's position had become increasingly precarious. Through all these trials, the love between Hope and William grew stronger rather than weaker, tested by adversity but not broken by the enormous pressures that were destroying families throughout the South. They discovered that the partnership they had built during peacetime could adapt to wartime challenges, providing mutual support and shared strength that neither could have found alone. Their physical relationship, deepened by the intensity of shared danger and the knowledge that each day together might be their last in the world they had known, became a source of comfort and renewal that helped them maintain hope despite the gathering darkness around them. In the privacy of their bedroom, with candlelight creating intimate circles of warmth and safety, they found refuge from the harsh realities that dominated their public lives. As the war intensified and Confederate demands grew more desperate, could their love and principles survive the increasingly impossible choice between survival and conscience that was facing every family in the South? The winter of 1864 brought privations to Blackwood Plantation that would have been unimaginable when Hope first arrived as William's bride 7 years earlier, transforming their once abundant world into a landscape of scarcity that tested every assumption about Southern prosperity and social stability. General Sherman's march through Georgia had sent streams of refugees fleeing northward into South Carolina, bringing with them tales of destruction that painted a grim picture of what might await anyone who had supported the Confederate cause or, worse, who had been suspected of insufficient loyalty to the Southern experiment in independence. The refugees who passed through the Ashley River Valley told stories that challenged everything Hope and William thought they understood about the nature of the conflict that was reshaping American society. Entire plantations had been burned to the ground, not because of military necessity, but as punishment for the sin of owning other human beings. Families who had lived in comfort for generations found themselves reduced to begging for food and shelter, their wealth destroyed, and their social position rendered meaningless by the harsh realities of military occupation. Yet it was during this darkest period that Hope and William's commitment to each other and their principles faced its greatest and most crucial test. Confederate authorities, growing increasingly desperate for resources as Union armies advanced deeper into the heartland of the Confederacy, issued an ultimatum that threatened to destroy everything they had worked so patiently to build over years of careful reform and gradual progress. The document that arrived on a February morning when frost covered the ground like a shroud was signed by the highest Confederate authorities in South Carolina and carried the weight of military law. Either William would provide forced labor for defensive construction projects around Charleston, reverting his freed workers to slave status for the duration of the emergency, or his plantation would be subject to immediate seizure as property belonging to a suspected Union sympathizer, whose disloyalty had been proven by his refusal to support the Confederate war effort with appropriate enthusiasm. The accusation of treason was not entirely unfounded, as William's well-documented opposition to slavery and his implementation of progressive labor policies had made him suspect among neighbors who measured patriotism by enthusiasm for the Confederate cause and loyalty by willingness to sacrifice everything for Southern independence. His care for the welfare of former slaves was interpreted as evidence of dangerous radicalism that undermined the very foundations of the society they were fighting to preserve. Standing in his study with the Confederate ultimatum spread across his desk like a death warrant for everything he held dear, William faced the choice that would define not only the rest of his life, but the kind of man his children would remember him to be. He could abandon his principles and force his freed workers back into bondage, preserving his property and his family's position in society, but destroying his soul and betraying every promise he had made to people who had trusted him with their futures. Alternatively, He could maintain his convictions and risk losing everything his family had built over 3 generations, the plantation that provided employment for hundreds of people, the wealth that supported not only his immediate family, but his obligations to the wider community, and the social position that had given him the influence necessary to implement reforms that had improved countless lives. Hope found him there in the lamplight as evening settled over the plantation, staring at papers that held the power to reshape their destiny in ways they could barely comprehend. When he looked up at her approach, she saw in his eyes the full weight of responsibility that comes with choosing between survival and honor, between practical necessity and moral principle, between the safety of those he loved most and the welfare of those who depended on his protection. Without speaking, she moved to stand beside his chair, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that spoke of unconditional support and shared commitment to whatever choice he would make. Her presence, warm and solid and infinitely comforting, reminded him that he was not facing this impossible decision alone, and that whatever consequences might follow would be borne together by 2 people whose love had grown strong enough to support any burden. "Whatever you decide," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm certainty that had sustained them through every previous crisis, "we will face together. Our children will be proud of their father's courage, regardless of what that courage costs us in worldly terms." The decision, when it finally crystallized in William's mind, surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of choosing between the 2 alternatives presented by Confederate authorities, he found a third path that required greater courage than either compliance or simple defiance would have demanded. He would voluntarily free all remaining enslaved workers on the plantation and offer Blackwood itself as a refuge for displaced families, both black and white, who needed sanctuary from the chaos of war's final stages. This decision represented the culmination of everything Hope and William had dreamed of achieving during their years of gradual reform. But it also constituted an act of such radical defiance of Confederate authority that it placed their entire family in immediate and mortal danger. By choosing to complete the transition to free labor during wartime, when such actions could be interpreted as deliberate sabotage of the Confederate war effort, William was risking not just his property, but his life and the lives of everyone he loved. The transformation of Blackwood Plantation from a model of enlightened slavery to a genuine community, of free families working together for mutual survival, represented a revolutionary experiment in interracial cooperation that had few parallels in the American South. Former slaves and their former master now worked side by side to feed and shelter refugees of both races, creating a living example of what Southern society might have become if it had chosen evolution over war, progress over tradition, humanity over racial prejudice. When Union forces finally reached the Ashley River Valley in February 1865, they found at Blackwood Plantation something unprecedented in their experience of occupying Confederate territory. Instead of the usual pattern of abandoned great houses and scattered, confused former slaves, they discovered a functioning community where people of different races worked together with mutual respect and shared purpose. The Union officers who investigated this unusual situation were initially skeptical, suspecting some form of deception or Confederate trick designed to conceal traditional slavery behind a facade of voluntary cooperation. Only after extensive interviews with community members and careful examination of legal documents did they conclude that William and Hope had indeed created something genuinely new and revolutionary, a demonstration that racial harmony and economic cooperation were possible when human dignity was respected regardless of skin color. Would this remarkable experiment in human equality survive the chaos of war's end and the challenging transition to a new social order, or would the prejudices and economic pressures of the post-war period destroy what love and principle had built during the darkest hours of American history? Spring returned to the South Carolina Lowcountry in 1865 with the tentative grace of a world learning to breathe again after 4 years of holding its breath, as if the very earth was uncertain whether it was safe to hope for renewal after so much destruction and loss. The formal surrender at Appomattox Courthouse had ended the fighting, but the monumental work of rebuilding, not just physical structures but entire ways of life, not just economic systems, but fundamental relationships between human beings, was only beginning to unfold across a landscape scarred by war and transformed by emancipation. At Blackwood Plantation, Hope and William faced this unprecedented challenge with the accumulated wisdom that comes from having already begun the transformation years earlier, when such changes were voluntary rather than imposed by military force. The community they had created through gradual emancipation and shared labor proved remarkably resilient in the face of post-war chaos that was destroying less adaptable plantations throughout the region. While neighboring estates struggled desperately to adapt to free labor imposed suddenly by Union occupation forces, Blackwood's workers already understood the complex relationship between effort and reward that made voluntary labor productive and sustainable. Families who had earned their freedom through years of patient progress under the innovative system William and Hope had developed now served as examples and teachers for former slaves throughout the Ashley River Valley who were learning to navigate the complicated realities of liberty without guidance or preparation. The economic success of their gradual transition attracted attention from Reconstruction officials who were struggling to implement federal policies throughout the defeated South with limited understanding of local conditions and virtually no experience in managing the transformation from slave to free labor. Hope and William found themselves hosting delegations of politicians, military officers, and social reformers who wanted to understand how voluntary emancipation had created a more stable and productive community than forced liberation. These visits, while flattering to their innovative approach, also created new challenges as federal authorities sought to impose standardized policies that might disrupt arrangements that had been carefully tailored to specific local circumstances. The delicate balance between federal requirements and community needs required constant negotiation and diplomatic skill that tested Hope and William's ability to protect their experiment while satisfying competing demands from multiple levels of government. Samuel Fairmont arrived at the plantation in late spring, wearing the uniform of a Union officer and carrying the confidence of a young man who had found his calling in military service. His graduation from West Point had been followed by service in the final campaigns of the war, where he had distinguished himself as an engineer officer responsible for rebuilding bridges and railroads in occupied Confederate territory. The reunion between brother and sister revealed the profound changes that war had worked on both of them. Hope, who had once worried primarily about social proprieties and family finances, had become a woman whose authority was recognized by people of all races and backgrounds, whose opinions on complex social and economic matters were sought by government officials and respected by community leaders. Samuel's admiration for what Hope and William had accomplished was evident in the way he listened to their plans for expanding their experiment in interracial cooperation and economic justice. His engineering background allowed him to appreciate the practical challenges they had overcome, while his military experience gave him insight into the political obstacles they would face as Reconstruction policies evolved. The children who had been born into this transformed world carried within themselves the promise of a different future. Charles, now 6 years old, moved through the plantation community with the unconscious ease of a child who had never known racial barriers as absolute truths. His playmates included children of all backgrounds, and his education, conducted in the expanded school that Hope had established, included lessons in equality and mutual respect that would have scandalized Charleston society just a few years earlier. Catherine, now 4 and possessed of her mother's gentle nature, combined with a determination that promised great things for the future, represented the possibility of a generation that might escape the prejudices and limitations that had shaped their parents. Hope often watched her daughter playing with children whose grandparents had been enslaved and saw in their easy friendship the kind of world that might be possible if the next generation could learn from their elders' mistakes rather than repeating them. The summer of 1865 brought the first post-war cotton crop to maturity, and its successful harvest represented both economic recovery and social transformation. The fields were worked by free laborers who owned shares in the crop they were producing, creating incentives for productivity that had never existed under the slavery system. The cooperative arrangement that had evolved from William's original experiments in gradual emancipation now provided a model for sustainable agriculture that attracted attention from throughout the South. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition of their achievement came from the families who had chosen to remain at Blackwood, despite offers of opportunity elsewhere. Old Ben, now in his 70s and acknowledged as the unofficial spokesman for the community's African-American families, expressed the feelings of many when he told William during the harvest celebration, "This here's home now, not 'cause we got to stay, but 'cause we want to." You and Miss Hope, you showed us what freedom really means. Not just the right to leave, but the right to stay and build something better for our children and grandchildren. That's the difference between true freedom and just running away from one master to find another. The economic success of their cooperative model attracted investment from northern businessmen who were looking for profitable ways to participate in the South's economic reconstruction. William's careful management and the community's proven productivity made Blackwood an attractive partner for merchants and manufacturers who needed reliable supplies of high-quality cotton and other agricultural products. These business relationships, managed with the same principled approach that had guided their social reforms, provided the capital necessary for further improvements in housing, education, and economic opportunity. The plantation's school expanded to include advanced courses that would prepare students for careers in teaching, business, and the skilled trades, while adult education programs helped parents develop the literacy and numeracy skills necessary for full participation in a free economy. As autumn approached and the year's work neared completion, Hope and William stood together on the veranda, where they had shared so many conversations over the years. Charles played at their feet, while Catherine napped in her mother's arms, and in the distance they could see families working fields that they now owned as shareholders in a cooperative venture that had grown from their original experiment in human dignity. The transformation of their world had been complete and irreversible. What had begun as a desperate young woman's attempt to save her family from financial ruin had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that love, when combined with principle and sustained by courage, could indeed change the world, one heart and one relationship at a time. "Do you ever regret the choice we made?" Hope asked, thinking of the comfortable certainty they had abandoned in favor of this more challenging but more honest way of life. William's answer came without hesitation, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had tested his principles against the hardest realities imaginable and found them sound. "The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to understand what you saw from the beginning, that love, whether between husband and wife or among neighbors. I grow stronger when it's freely given rather than demanded by force or maintained by fear." As the sun set over the Ashley River, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead, Hope felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and love well shared. The plantation around them was no longer a monument to human bondage, but a community built on dignity, respect, and the revolutionary idea that all people, regardless of race or previous condition, deserved the chance to shape their own destinies. The journey that had begun with a desperate young woman facing financial ruin had ended with a mature couple who had learned to find prosperity through principles rather than in spite of them. Their love, tested by war and transformation, poverty and persecution, had become the foundation for something larger than themselves, a community that proved change was possible when it was guided by courage, sustained by patience and motivated by an unshakable faith in human dignity. In the gathering twilight, with their children sleeping peacefully and their community settling into the rhythms of another day's honest labor completed, Hope and William Blackwood had created more than just a successful plantation or even a loving marriage. They had built a legacy of hope that would endure long after their own stories had become family legend, proof that love combined with principle could indeed transform the world, creating ripples of positive change that would spread outward through generations yet unborn. The future stretched before them, uncertain in its details, but certain in its promise that their children would inherit not just material prosperity, but moral wealth beyond measure, the knowledge that their parents had chosen to do what was right rather than what was easy, and had proven that love, when it is true and strong and guided by conscience, can overcome any obstacle and heal any wound that human folly has created.